I'm Soumya. I'm a product manager with Capacity, working on Capacity's developer platform. Today, we'll be walking through what developer platform is and how you can use the developer platform to build your skills and conversations using apps. Now that was a loaded sentence. I'm going to break it down through the demo. So today's agenda will cover what Dev Platform is. We will walk through case studies of different use cases on how people have used the Dev Platform. I'll walk through the key components of Dev Platform. I'll do a live demo after that, and then we'll recap and point to certain resources. Okay, so what is Dev Platform? The Dev Platform lets you access everything that is stored within your company, but inside of apps, let's say Salesforce or Jira or any app that your company uses, and you have information stored inside them. But to take a step back, I always give an example of what I tell my mom, what I do at Capacity. I tell her that what if instead of checking all of the different apps that you use every day to find out your bank balance, grocery deliveries, email customer support if you want to cancel a flight or something. Instead of all that, what if you could chat, find out all of this information from a single interface? And if she could do that from a single interface, she would use something like Capacity. So Dev Platform lets you talk to all of your apps in natural language and lets you retrieve information that's stored within them. To do this, you have to do three things. Set up the app integration on Capacity's developer platform, then publish the app to the App Store, and then turn it on and use it to build a guided conversation that will address the use case that you have in mind. Let's take a look at some example use cases that you could achieve using Dev Platform. So the first one is for loan officers. Let's say they want to retrieve a customer's loan amount and increase the amount that this particular customer takes out as a loan. They could do that using Capacity. Just say increase the amount of customer loans. The Capacity will come back from any loan origination system that they use, let's say Encompass, and pull out that given loan and then ask for the amount, for the new amount that they want to update it to. Similarly, any employee can go to Capacity to request a PTO, and they can view if they have the available balance required for their PTO, and then mention the number of days off that they would need to take. And then their manager would get a notification that their reportee has requested for a PTO. Similarly, you can update your 401k contribution or capture lead information and then populate a CRM. Let's take a look at how a conversation to update your 401k contribution would look like with Capacity. Capacity starts off with a generic welcome message, and then you can ask Capacity to change your 401k contribution percentage. You have multiple options. You can select the option you want, and then Capacity will ask for the new amount that you want to contribute. In this case, I want to update from $200 to $400. And then you have to specify, you have to agree to the transaction. And Capacity will work with your HRIS system, whether that's ADP or Workday, to update that information. Okay, now that we have seen an example of how Capacity can talk with your apps and retrieve information and let you do perform actions on your apps, let's walk through the key components of Dev Platform. Okay, as I mentioned before, the developer platform is where you can set up your app integration. An app in developer platform is a collection of APIs and settings that are shared between all of the APIs, whether that's a client ID, client secret, a token, or a hostname, etc. This is also where you publish your app once you have set up and tested all of your APIs. Once you have created your app, you can add APIs from here. And an API, we support REST APIs, and a REST API is essentially a programming interface to access an app's functionality programmatically instead of using a visual interface. For example, you use Google Maps to get around. It has a graphical interface, but a lot of companies like Uber and Yelp, they use Google Maps APIs to achieve the same functionality inside of their own product. Each API has a method and an endpoint, which lets you access the app's functionality, and it also has a request and a response. We only support REST APIs in Dev Platform along with JSON request and response. So that's one of the limitations that we have set up for our platform. And to look up APIs for a given app, let's say Salesforce, you usually go to the developer docs section of their website, let's say Sales for Developer Docs, or you can even search more specific apps, APIs such as Salesforce Search API or ADP payroll APIs, and you'll find what you need. Let's look at this video and see the things that we can do while adding APIs. It's pretty basic, like any API. There's a get method, an endpoint, you have headers, you have a request body, and once you have populated all of this, you can enter a value for the inputs or params and test the API, and you will get back a response body and headers. So we saw what an app is. We saw how you can add APIs to an app. But the important part of adding APIs is that you can expose certain parameters back to the user using something called conversation inputs and conversation outputs. What this means is that you expect to collect certain fields from the user during a conversation and send some of these variables back to the user as conversation outputs. Again, let's walk through a video of how you can set up conversation inputs and outputs, how you can add and remove them, and we'll see later how it's used in a conversation. So as you can see, anything within that double bracket is a conversation input. Anything that you put in a double bracket will be automatically added to the conversation inputs table, where you can put a test value and test the API. And later, when you receive a response from the API, you can set up conversation outputs. You can set up conversation outputs directly using JSON path. JSON path is a way to access a certain field within a JSON request or a response. So as soon as you provide the right JSON path, you'll see the output populated in the conversation outputs table. Now that we have set up our APIs and we have set up conversation inputs and outputs, you can publish the app from the app details page, and it will appear in the App Store. In the App Store, you can turn your app on and off, and if there are certain app settings that have been set up in the app details page to be collected while turning the app on or off, you can enter those values here as well. Okay, now the third and the most important part is the guided conversation. This is how everything that we have built till now comes together. A guided conversation is essentially a conversation with the end user that has been pre-built by your company, and it guides the user through a certain path. There can be multiple paths depending on what values you collect during the conversation. There are different kinds of cards supported in guided conversation. One of them is called collect information, where you collect variables from the end user, whether it's their birthday or their email IDs or what movie they want to look up or what's the organization they work for. It can be absolutely anything. The other kind of card that we support is called multiple paths. In multiple paths card, we provide a set of options to the end user, and we ask them to choose a given option. As you can see here, while I was building this guided conversation, I had two paths, yes and no. and the conversation looks different for each of the paths. And now the next one is an action card, which I'll talk more about in the next slide. You can also send emails to anybody using a guided conversation. Okay, the action card in the guided conversation connects a conversation with the app you just integrated. When you add an app to a conversation, you can see all the APIs that belong to that app, and you can take actions using those APIs anywhere in a conversation. When you add an API, let's say this is an OMDB API, which is an open movie database, it expects certain inputs and outputs. These inputs and outputs are the same ones that you set up while you are building the app and you set up the conversation inputs and outputs. What this does is that it controls the amount of information that is shown to the person building this conversation, so that they're not, so that they only see what they need. And anything that comes out of the output of an action card can be used later in a guided conversation. Okay, now we have seen how you can set up the app, we have seen the App Store, and we have also seen how you can build a guided conversation. Let's do a live demo using all of these components. So this is how the developer platform looks like. It has a bunch of apps that users have built. Let's check out the IMDb app because it is a cool app integration. So this app has already been built by us. It has one API, which is the Open Movie Database API. And you can see that you can upload a logo for the app. You can set a name and description. You can publish the app. This is already published. If there were settings that were common across multiple APIs, you could add settings here. And if this app used OAuth, you could also add a OAuth config here. So this OMDB API, it's a GET call. A GET call is used to only retrieve information and not take any action. It expects one parameter, which is a movie name. As you can see, it's in double curly braces, which is why it shows up in the conversation inputs table. And this is an API key that I've set up. Again, each API has a name, it has a description, and there's a status for the API which says it's active. You can only use active APIs in a conversation. The body and the headers for this particular API is blank. Okay, let's give a value to our movie. Let's say we want to get information for Batman. You can see that the response comes back with results from the API. There's actors, awards, box office, country, etc. But we don't want to send everything back to the user, which is why we set up conversation outputs. And we select which fields we want to send back to the end user. Let's say I set up actors, country, director, and all of these fields. And I can see the corresponding output here. And it lets me verify that this field actually exists in the response, and the user will get back something valid. The display name here is a name that is used in the guided conversation to refer to this variable. For example, this one had a complicated JSON path. So instead of having a complicated variable name, you can call it something else and have that as a display name instead. Okay. Now that we have set up this app, everything in this API builder is auto-saved, so you don't have to save or worry about losing your data. Okay, now that we have set up the app and the API integration, which was our first part, we can publish this app. This app is already published. I don't want to unpublish it. I can go to the App Store, and there are a bunch of apps. IMDb here is turned on. For now, it's just a simple toggle. You can turn it on or turn it off. You can't turn it off if it's being used in a conversation though. Now that that app is turned on for our organization, this is an example conversation that you can build using this app. Let's say the inquiry that you want the end user to ask is get movie information for param 1. Param 1 is essentially a placeholder for anything. It could be essentially anything. And this is how a guided conversation looks like. I can edit the conversation. I have already added IMDb as an app to this conversation. It's not available by default. You have to specifically go and say, add this particular app to this conversation. And I have built this conversation already, but you can see that it's very customizable. You can change the way this conversation is designed. You can collect extra information from the end user if you want to personalize it more to their preferences. We have a multiple path card, which asks me if this is the movie, which confirms essentially if this is the movie I want to look up. If I say yes, it then calls the OMDB API, which was in the IMDb app. It takes the movie name as an input, and it gives out a bunch of fields as outputs, and I can customize the message that I want to send back to the end user. Again, on my no path, it was just a simple message. Okay. Now that we have set up this conversation, let's see how this experience looks like from the chatbot. I say get the information for the same one we tested for Batman. Capacity comes back. Capacity knows my name. It asks me if I want to get info for the movie Batman. I say yes. And then it comes back with a bunch of information. The director of Batman was Tim Burton, and it was released on this, so you won't be surprised if you see unfamiliar name. And the movie was filmed in these locations, and it has an IMDb rating of 7.5 and a runtime of 126 minutes. So even though this is probably something that an organization will never use or set up as an app integration, it shows all the information that you can pull from an app and the flexibility of use cases that you can implement using a guided conversation and an app integration. So just to recap everything that we have covered so far and how you can get started using the Dev platform, these are the series of steps that you need to take. The first step is to determine your use cases. Even if you integrate your app, you set up all of these API integrations, having a concrete use case in mind when you start is very helpful for you to know what APIs you would need, what fields from that API you would want to expose to the end user to a conversation. First, determine your use case. After you have determined your use case, you can collect all the credentials and endpoints that you might need to solve that particular use case. Once you have the endpoints, you can build your integration, and then you can build a guided conversation. Once you have built the guided conversation, you can set group permissions to whichever group needs to have access to that conversation, and then they can start chatting with Capacity. So that's it for me. There are certain resources that you can use to get help. We have all of this is documented on our docs website, capacity.com/developer platform. You can also go to the help or send an email to support@capacity.com. Thank you.